Mas Nguyen and Mas Rizny, can we put the video in loop?
Distinguished representatives and decision makers from national disaster management organizations of the ASEAN member states, government institutions, research and the academe, humanitarian and development organizations, ASEAN dialogue, sectoral and development partners, private sector, media, and the general public. A pleasant morning, afternoon, or evening to all of you wherever you are. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the third session of the ASEAN Risk Monitor and Disaster Management Review ARMOR webinar series. I am L.A. Dimailig of the AHA Center, and I will be your moderator host for today. At this point, I would like to invite Ibu Adelina Kamal, Executive Director of the AHA Center, to deliver her welcome remarks. Over to you, Ibu Adelina.
Thank you very much, LA. And good morning from Jakarta, Indonesia. Selamat pagi. I hope that all of you are well. Thank you again for joining the third ARMOR webinar series of the AHA Center. We are here today to discuss 2 out of the 9 articles in our second edition of ARMOR. ARMOR stands for the ASEAN Risk Monitor and Disaster Management Review. It's a major publication of the AHA Center where we attempt to bridge science and decision making. Through this annual publication, we ask the questions and we ask our partners, the authors, to answer this question together with us. And these questions are pertinent to our region. These questions are relevant to our region, the Southeast Asian region. And then the AHA Center present this question and answers into articles in a comprehensible manner so that the disaster management practitioners as well as the humanitarian responders can use the articles to help them in decision making as well as reducing risk and saving lives. For the 9 articles in the second edition of ARMOR, we worked together with 25 authors. and some of them are here with us today. I hope that you had the chance to read the articles in the Armor, the second articles before this webinar. But if you didn't have the chance, stay tuned in this channel as the authors themselves will present the articles and their findings and discuss with us, the AHA Center and the audience. If you didn't have the chance to read the other 7 articles in the Armor, you could check the recordings of our webinars in November as well as in January and join the 4th webinar in early April. If you think that you won't have the time to read the 2nd edition of Armor at all, and if you ask me to summarize the 9 articles in the 2nd edition of Armor into just 2 words, that will be anticipatory action. Just 2 words. Basically, that is the essence of the 2nd edition of Armor. So why? Why anticipatory action? We all know that the world is melting. The scientists have said so with evidence. Greta has said so with evidence. It's no longer a Hollywood movie. It's real. The climate emergencies are with us today. And now we have this new complexity, and we call it COVID-19. And couple that with climate emergencies. It's no longer about new normal. It's next normal. It's a complete abnormal. For us, disaster management practitioners and humanitarian practitioners, we cannot be firefighting all the time. We cannot be in response mode all the time and wait for the disasters to get bigger. Why? Why? Because in a world of next normal, with climate emergencies, with the complexity, pandemic, and all the other risks before us, no country and no one is safe anymore. And that is, by the way, the 2nd chapter of Armor written by LA and Keith, my colleagues, together with Pacific Disaster Center. So therefore, we need to have more anticipatory and more preventive measures. Disaster responders and humanitarian community should change our mindset from crisis to risk management approach. ASEAN, including AHA Center, need to shift towards a forecast-based humanitarian response. And that is what chapter 1 of Armor recommends. So please do read our 2nd edition of Armor. For today, we will learn from the authors as well as the commentators and the audience how to do all this, how to shift into forecast-based humanitarian response, how to change our mindset from crisis to risk management approach. We will listen to the evidence from the Red Cross community, and we will listen to the models from the Met Service, ASMC, ASEAN Specialized Meteorological Center in Singapore, and RIMES. I know that there are challenges. It's not going to be easy, but the good news is that there are good practices, there are models, and we have help. And for that reason, I'm pleased to announce that the AHA Center will join the Anticipation Hub, following the kind invitation by the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, IFRC. I'm happy that the head of the Anticipation Hub, Ms. Alexandra Ruth from the German Red Cross, is here with us today as one of the commentators. I hope that by AHA Center joining the Anticipation Hub, we can connect with other practitioners to learn from them new knowledge, new products, techniques, and technologies in anticipatory actions, so we don't firefight all the time. In closing, on behalf of the AHA Center, I'd like to thank all the authors from IFRC, Philippine Red Cross, Vietnam Red Cross, Service Singapore, ASEAN Specialized Meteorological Center, and our commentators from the UN World Food Program Regional Office for Asia Pacific in Bangkok, and German Red Cross who are here with us today. Thank you so much for your time, for your contribution. I look forward to learning from you. And I will now hand it over to my colleague LA Lawrence. We call him LA to serve as today's moderator. Over to you, LA.
Thank you, Ibu Adelina, for the warm welcome, introducing what Armor is, and for giving us this exciting news regarding anticipatory action in the ASEAN region. Today, we are going to talk about forecasts. I know it might sound technical and maybe boring for some, but indulge us. We'll try our best to communicate these technical topics in an easy to understand manner. Whether we notice it or not, we actually frequently use forecasts. Sometimes, when we plan to travel to another location, we consult the internet. What will the temperature and weather be? If it's going to be cold, don't we bring clothes that could protect us from freezing? Or if it's going to be hot, logically, we bring clothes that's going to make us more comfortable. If you're going to the workplace or the school, for instance, and you know that it's going to rain because that's what the forecasts say, aren't you going to bring an umbrella? These are just some of the everyday examples when we use forecast information to prepare ourselves for risks that are yet to come. From the perspective of a disaster manager, timely and accurate forecast information that a strong rain is going to occur means an opportunity to reduce disaster risk. From 2012 to February 2021, the ASEAN Disaster Information Network, or ADINET, recorded over 2,500 disasters. Of this figure, over 95% are caused by hazards that are hydro-meteo-climatological in nature. These are natural hazards that present science and technology can forecast and predict. If we can already predict what hazard might happen, when and where a disaster could occur, and identify who are the most vulnerable, isn't that a powerful tool to save lives and reduce the damaging impact of hazards? If we have the power of anticipation, what early actions are we going to do? This and many more interesting discussions as we focus on shifting into a forecast-based regional humanitarian response, where we are going to discuss two articles in the Armor second edition. The first article is Chapter 6, When Early Actions Save Lives, Anticipating Instead of Reacting with Forecast-Based Financing, contributed by our partners from the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, IFRC, Philippine Red Cross, Vietnam Red Cross, German Red Cross, and the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. This article discusses how the ASEAN region can address the various impacts of climate change through a proactive approach called forecast-based financing, rather than relying on traditional reactive approaches. Today, we are joined by Mr. Raymond Zingg, forecast-based financing coordinator for the Asia-Pacific region of the IFRC, Mr. Ferdinand Ferrer, administrator of the Philippine Red Cross Camarines Norte chapter, and Mr. Nguyen An, vice president and secretary general of the Vietnam Red Cross Society. The second article is Chapter 7, 3 weeks notice, forecasting extreme weather events with subseasonal-to-seasonal climate prediction, contributed by our partners from the ASEAN Specialized Meteorological Center Singapore, United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, UNESCOP, and the Regional Integrated Multi-Hazard Early Warning System for Africa and Asia, RIMES. This article illustrates the potential applications for disaster preparedness of bridging shorter-term weather forecasts with seasonal predictions within the ASEAN region. Today, we are joined by Dr. Thea Thurkington, Senior Research Scientist in the Seasonal and Subseasonal Prediction Branch of the Meteorological Service Singapore, and Dr. Govindarajalu Srinivasan, Chief Scientist for Climate Applications of RIME. Lastly, we are also joined by two distinguished panelists to comment on the article's findings and further enrich today's discussions. We have Ms. Alexandra Ruth, Head of the Anticipation Hub, with years of experience in the humanitarian and development sector and the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement. And Mr. Nicholas Bido, Head of the Vulnerability Assessment and Monitoring of the UN World Food Program, WFP, Regional Bureau for Asia and the Pacific, with vast experience working with UN agencies since 2003. Now, as we start the discussion, I want to inform all attendees that you can ask questions anytime during the whole discussion through the Q&A feature of this online platform. You can find the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. Our panelists will respond to your inquiries in due time. Without further ado, I would like to invite the panelists for the first article. Mr. Zingg of IFRC, Mr. Ferrer of the Philippine Red Cross, Mr. Nguyen of the Vietnam Red Cross, Ms. Ruth of the Anticipation Hub, and Mr. Bido of the WFP. Good morning, distinguished panelists. Now, as we proceed with our discussion, this topic, forecast-based financing, it sounds a bit technical. It sounds something that most people might not be familiar with, right? So, first question, just a starter for our discussion. Forecast-based financing. If you are going to explain it to a grade schooler, how can you explain it in simple terms? I think I'd like to ask this question to our colleague from the IFRC. Mr. Zingg, over to you.
Thank you so much, Elaine. Thank you so much also, Adelina, for the very warm welcome and, of course, the passionate opening remarks that really highlight why we need to take anticipatory action. Yeah, I think it's a good question. So how can we explain anticipatory action or forecast-based financing to a grade schooler? I guess you could say, well, forecast-based financing is like having a little crystal ball that tells you what is going to happen in the very short term, maybe the next few hours or days or weeks. But maybe not only that, it also tells you when and where it is going to happen. Plus also it tells you, is it really bad? Or is it just something that happens all the time? So you have these different, I guess, aspects to that. Another component of forecast-based financing, besides the forecasting, is of course the early actions. If you want to explain it in very simple terms, I guess you could say if you learn how to ride a bicycle, you could install already supporting wheels and wear a helmet, because we already know, well, at some point it is very likely that you're going to fall, no? So the early actions here are in advance, and they really reduce the impact of you falling. And then I think the last aspect, the financing, is equally important. It is a bit like the lunch money that you get from your parents. It is always there. It is somehow the speed and reliability of the funding. It is also for a very specific purpose. It is to allow you to buy food for your lunch. You could buy sweets, I guess, or a toy, but that's not what it's for. So I think forecast-based financing really is an anticipatory approach that addresses the very short-term, I guess, effects of climate change. As you mentioned, there are more frequent and more severe climate impacts, and forecast-based financing can address those. But it can also address those for the beneficiaries that are affected most by it. So at the local level, because climate change does not affect everyone equally. It is normally the poorest and most vulnerable who are affected by that. And forecast-based financing also allows you to have a very specific and localized understanding of where these impacts happen. And then we would adjust the early actions to address that. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that because I think these are my 3 minutes already.
Thank you, Mr. Zingg. So really forecast-based financing is like three parts in one. The first part is really where the scientist comes in. That is where they provide this forecast information. And the second is where the disaster managers come in, how they use that forecast information to do some early actions. So by early actions, what we mean is before the disaster really occurs, you've already done something. And then lastly is the financing part, because all of this requires some financing mechanism so that it can be institutionalized and being done by the government. There's another very good point raised by Mr. Zingg, and that is really the local knowledge, because these early action protocols that are being done in relation to the forecast-based financing projects are really something that has been consulted with the local knowledge. This is something that is really useful for the local population. And what better way to understand better what forecast-based financing is than to really look at specific examples of how forecast-based financing has been implemented in several ASEAN member states. So I think we're going to start with the Philippines. So I'm going to invite Mr. Ferdinand Ferrer. Mr. Ferdinand Ferrer, in the article, in the chapter 6 article, there is a mention that there are some early action protocols that have been implemented by the Philippine Red Cross for tropical cyclone at-risk communities in the Philippines. In particular, in your province, the province of Camarines, Norte. So now we see that there has been already an implementation of forecast-based financing. My question to you, sir, how different after you've implemented the forecast-based financing with these early action protocols, how different are the impacts of doing these early action protocols compared with the traditional post-disaster response where actions are only done after the fact or after the disaster occurred?
Thank you, sir. Good morning to everyone. For the Philippines, the forecast-based financing is a game changer on the anticipatory actions that have been done to supplement or augment procedures or actions that we have on imminent threats such as typhoons or tropical cyclones. And significant development had been attributed to this forecast-based financing program. One of this is the increased collaboration effort by the DRRM actors, including the local government units, the NGOs, partners, and stakeholders on the need on anticipatory response actions. Another real is the acknowledgement of the importance of the key actors on the implementation or complementing the early actions that have taken by them on preemptive evacuations to communities. So we are connecting these early actions activities and programs to supplement these existing activities. And again, we have the communities on the direct impact to communities with comparison on beneficiaries of the program to non-beneficiaries who have implemented early actions. So these areas are coastal areas facing the Pacific, and most of them have done the early actions, though this FBF program is to supplement the activities that is going in the communities. Another is the behavioral changes on the communities that we have have witnessed on the anticipatory actions that have been done by the beneficiaries as compared to non-beneficiaries. And these initiatives have been replicated on the process and procedures and how to do it. So it's a big thing that these initiatives are making aware, making awareness to the communities uh, to first specifically to strengthen their houses for the shelter strengthening, as an example.
Thank you, Mr. Ferrer, and for identifying the specific early action protocol that has been implemented in the province of Camarines Norte. Basically, what happened is once the forecast information regarding a tropical cyclone has been provided by the National Meteorological Service of the Philippines, it's PAGASA, once they've provided this forecast information that a typhoon is going to hit Camarines Norte, then the Philippine Red Cross is going to implement their early action protocol. And that specific early action protocol is related to house strengthening. So before the typhoon hits the houses and damages the houses, they are already supporting the communities by providing them with a house strengthening shelter kit. So whereby they're going to strengthen their house. So once the typhoon passes, logically their house should be safe and sound. Now, of course, we wanted to be scientific about this approach. We wanted to really see whether this early action protocols are really helpful. Now, a portion of the article is actually comparing the impact of shelter strengthening from the non-beneficiaries of the early action protocols and with the beneficiaries of the early action protocols. I would like to invite our ICT team to please flash a graph, which I would like to quickly describe. So here we can see that there are two charts. The first chart is basically you can see that there's a lot of blue portion in those two bars. Each bar are basically pertaining to a province. So one province is Catanduanes and the second is Camarines Norte. The blue bar basically represents that these are the non-beneficiaries that strengthened their house. So meaning to say, once they heard from the news that a tropical cyclone is going to hit their province, they already strengthened their house. So we can see that there's already this practice in their provinces. They are already strengthening their houses. Now, let's go to the bottom chart. In the bottom chart, the two bars are talking about the beneficiaries, the one on the left, and the non-beneficiaries, the one on the right. As we can see, the blue color means that these are the number or percentage of people that after the typhoon passes, they still repaired their houses. So as we can see here, the beneficiaries of the early action protocol, only a small percentage of them repair their houses after their house has been strengthened through the early action protocol. But for the non-beneficiaries, even though they strengthened their house, we can see that still a huge number of them still repaired their houses. So we would like to know, how is this, what's the reason for this finding? Is this because there other than the early action information that is being provided through the early action protocol, are you also providing them with the correct or with the appropriate shelter strengthening kits? Or what other reasons could be behind this finding? Back to you, Mr.
Yes, thank you for that. On these infographics presented that we have, although communities specifically in coastal areas was able to conduct house strengthening for or on anticipatory actions at individual level for tropical cyclones or weather disturbances. We have significant damage to houses, especially to non-beneficiaries. This will be attributed to the prioritization of the needs during these times. We must remember that these areas as priority areas already mostly have weak shelters, and most commonly these people are laborers low-income households and tenants or farmers, or who may be prioritizing food rather than the shelter strengthening in their areas, or livelihoods rather than shelter strengthening. Also, this can also be attributed to the shelter strengthening kits that the program has been providing for the beneficiaries, and this will be in comparison to the initiatives that are done by the household level to non-beneficiaries, including the materials used on shelter strengthening, included or maybe not limited to ropes or tie wire or banana trunk or other resources that may be available within the area. One example of that are sandbags. They're using sandbags also, tires, etc., and plywood. That other resources that can be used to strengthen the shelters. And the techniques will be also the techniques on strengthening their houses, tying roofs or strengthening the windows, or tying it on the large trees or materials that can help strengthen their houses. And also the processes that is being done during the procedures, or the procedures that have been done on the household level, and during this time, maybe a certain member of the family is available during these times to do this shelter strengthening, and not by skilled workers. So we can see that the household implemented early action than shelter strengthening had much lesser damage on a shelter than those who did not. And same with the household that's needed repairs after the impact of that tropical cyclone to beneficiary and non-beneficiary. Other factors will be the effectiveness of the shelter strengthening kits being provided for the PRC. The most appropriate cost-effective design has been in partnership with the Build Change Philippines, so that this shelter strengthening will be efficient on the implementation on the shelter strengthening on the houses for the beneficiaries compared to non-beneficiaries. And this same the effectiveness of early action on shelter strengthening, considerably reducing the overall cost of fixing the houses to post-disasters or recovery programs.
Thank you, Mr. Ferrer. So really, what we've seen here is regarding the early action protocol, there is really a need for some research to be conducted to identify the early action that could be done. So in this very example from the Philippine Red Cross, there is really some investments done on identifying the appropriate, cost-effective shelter strengthening kit that they are going to provide towards the beneficiaries. Now, from being wet, let's go towards identifying what other applications of forecast-based financing have been done inside the ASEAN region. Now, let's go to an example that is dry. Let's talk about heat waves. And I'm going to ask this question to Mr. Nguyen. Mr. Nguyen, for the Vietnam example of the forecast-based financing, the specific early action protocol that Vietnam conducted, the Vietnam Red Cross conducted, is related to the heat waves. Can you briefly share with us how you are conducting this early action protocol related to the heat wave? And is it possible to estimate the number of affected populations with and without these interventions provided by the Vietnam Red Cross? Over to you, Mr. Nguyen.
Thank you very much, LA. Very good morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. First of all, I would like to thank the organizer for inviting VNRC to speak in this very timely and significant ARMOR webinar series, section 3. Regarding the question that LA just addressed to Vietnam Red Cross Society, it is my pleasure to say that the VNRC early action plans on heat wave with support from German Red Cross focus on the person working outdoor or living in informal settlement in urban contexts. We have been doing 3 surveys conducted in Hanoi and Da Nang with more than 1,600 interviewees. Revealed that the outdoor workers are very exposed to heat wave risk. For example, they work under the sun for more than 8 hours per day, indicating a potential for high exposure to heat. And only 7% in Hanoi and 10.2% in Da Nang City reported using air conditioning during extreme heat. Indeed, the most vulnerable groups do not have access to shopping malls or other areas in which they could find relief from the day heat. In addition, they don't have cooling system in their house, as they usually live in informal settlements with inappropriate insulations. This includes poor rented houses, dormitories, and slum built with poor materials. So to answer the questions, we estimate that around 257,000 people in Hanoi, Da Nang, and Haiphong City live in those informal settlements and therefore are the most affected by the impact of heat wave. With the mappings methodology developed by the for the early action protocol, VNRC was able to prioritize the 10% most at risk ward. The methodology comprised data of 3 different layers of information. First, exposure. Second, vulnerability. And third, hazards. The 10% highest risk was 29 in total, words with a large population living in informal settlement, which is the exposure layer. A high percentage of people who are poor, elderly, disabled, or under the age of 5, which is the vulnerability layer, and with higher concentration of heat, which is the hazard layer. We estimate that around 145,000 people live in informal settlement in those 10% highest risk wards. Our EAP aims to reach around 25,000 persons in the 3 cities with the aim to reduce their mobility and their occurrence of heat exhaustion symptoms due to lack of awareness and lack of access to cool, shaded places. Thus, with the EAP interventions, 25,000 less persons will be affected by the impact of heat waves as compared without the interventions. This will be achieved through operating 54 community cooling centers, 29 cooling buses, and through the visits of 5 slums for awareness campaign on the risk of heat and action to avoid or reduce them. 18% of the target population living in poor settlement will be reached in the 29 implementation ward. In addition to Facebook communication campaign, aim to reach indirectly 213,000 people from 3 cities, representing 34% of the total population of the 29 selected wards. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nguyen. Based on the second edition of the Armor, it basically says that extreme weather events are going to occur more frequently. This, of course, includes heat waves. So this might be something that might be felt by more citizens in Vietnam in the coming years. Second question at you, Mr. Nguyen, is currently the heat wave early action protocol of the Vietnam Red Cross. Any plans of the Vietnam Red Cross Society to scale up this heat wave early action protocol to other cities in Vietnam? And are there plans to pursue institutionalization of this early action protocol into the government mechanisms in Vietnam? Back to you, sir.
Thank you very much. To prepare the replication of the early action protocols on heat wave to other cities, triggers have been calculated in collaboration with IMHEN for the 10 biggest cities of Vietnam, with a 5-year return period. For those cities, the FBF by the direct funding mechanism of the IFRC could be used to implement the same early action in those cities. In addition, with the view to implement the protocol for lower level of heat index for annual heat wave, for those 10 cities triggers with a 1-year return periods have also been developed. If reached, the EAP could be implemented with other sources of funding, such as private or provincial and city government funds. And we will soon start a new project supported by the German Red Cross to explore those funding mechanisms. And you could also add on the institutionalization of FBF within the VNRC Strategic Plan 2020-2030s. And we are already almost launching our strategy for development to the year 2030. And in this strategy, FBF will be one of our pillar of work regarding the disaster response. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nguyen. Now, we've seen some examples of how forecast-based financing has been conducted in the Philippines and in Vietnam. But currently, most, if not all, of the ASEAN member states, their current emergency response mechanisms are a bit different. It might not be something that is readily supportive of this kind of approach. Why? Because if most, if not all, of the ASEAN member states, they can only tap the emergency funding if disaster already occurred, or if a state of calamity has already been set. Now, I have a question for our commentator from the Anticipation Hub, Ms. Alexander Ruth. Given this current emergency funding mechanism of the ASEAN member states, where it only allows the government to access or retrieve emergency funds once the hazard occurred, what concrete actions should the ASEAN member states do if they want to transition into a forecast-based financing system in view of this current financing mechanism constraint? Over to you, Ms. Ruth.
Thank you very much for this question. But let me first congratulate you to these articles of the Armor review. I think that's really an excellent work and so much needed. And thank you, Adelina Kamal, for your welcoming words. And we are so excited having AHA Center on board of the Anticipation Hub. This is really we need really, the Anticipation Hub needs to be grounded. We need experience and lessons learned from the region. So we are really looking forward to a good collaboration. But now back to your important question. So it's true, it's still, the humanitarian system is still so much about firefighting. And I really like the welcoming words, and this is something which has to change. And the good thing is that it's slowly changing. So speaking from the Red Cross, Red Crescent experience we have now, and Mr. An from Vietnam Red Cross mentioned it, and Sir Ferdinand from Philippines Red Cross mentioned it, IFRC has now an ex-ante fund, so specifically for forecast-based financing implementation, the FBA by the TREF, which allows our partners to count on the speed and reliability of funding for timely implementation of anticipatory action. So I think that is really a very important shift. We overall can see a trend of adjusting existing disaster management funds to more anticipatory approaches, which is very, very positive and needed. For example, the UN's SURF is incorporating more possibilities for ex-ante funding, and that can help really to bring anticipatory action to scale. But I would like not to mention only global funding mechanisms, because I think it's very much needed to have regional funding mechanisms and national funding mechanisms. So one example, in the Philippines, the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council, under the Office of Civil Defense, revised the Memo 60 in June 2019. And that is a major step towards more anticipatory action using national fundings. And that revision of the Memo 60 is allowing local government units to declare a state of calamity based on a scientific forecast. So the LGUs, the local government units, will be allowed to access their quick response fund for early actions if the forecast shows at least 15% of the population is likely to be affected by the forecasted hazard. So in general, to summarize, I think that really moving away from only firefighting, and I don't think firefighting is bad. I mean, firefighting will be needed always, and due to climate crisis, and we will need really strong response mechanisms. But I think we can use better the existing data, the work on forecast systems, on knowing better vulnerabilities as well. So really this different layers, using these different layers to do more anticipatory action. So I think that ASEAN member states could work towards legislation that allows the use of existing funds for anticipatory action. And we, as the Anticipation Hub and the different partners in our network, we would really be proud of supporting ASEAN member states by providing policy and advocacy documents that highlight the benefits of ex-ante funding. I think we really have to jointly work in convincing donors and humanitarian actors moving towards more anticipatory action. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Now we're seeing that not just at the global level, but even up down to the national level, there are already some steps being undertaken by the ASEAN member states, or there are already some future steps to be undertaken by the ASEAN member states that could help them transition towards anticipatory action. Now, I have another question, and I would like to ask this to our colleague from the WFP, Mr. Nicholas Bido. My question to you: what if the ASEAN member states already adopted the anticipatory action? So based on the early warning information, they did early action protocols. They've done something. But early warning information is, it's like a possibilities, probabilities. It may or may not happen. What if, based on the early warning information, they did some early action protocols, but the hazard did not occur? What are your thoughts on this?
Thank you, Ele, for the tough question. You leave it to me. First, let me thank you and the AR Center and Ibu Adalina for inviting WFP to this very important webinar. I think to bring the visibility in this region on anticipatory action is fundamental. We heard from Alexandra, there's a lot of growing interest from the UN under the SURF, from donor interest is growing, and this is the moment now that we have, the opportunity we have to bring anticipatory action in this region. So thank you so much for showing the leadership. So now, back to the tough question. When we are used to spend the money after the disaster, what about if we put the money in and the disaster didn't occur? Have we wasted all this money? This is a tough question. Now, the good news is, first, that if the event doesn't occur, that's a good news. That's a positive result. We have not, the vulnerable communities have not been impacted. Let's acknowledge that. Second, there's a fundamental principle that we need to shift into with anticipatory action. It's the aspects of the no regret. It has to be inherent into the anticipatory action. The no regret that we have done an activity and the shock has not happened, but yet it was not in vain. And why is that? First, because anticipatory action, we've heard it throughout this morning so far, were based on probabilistic and risk of a risk to occur. It's all about probability. But what about if the typhoon has changed the path in the last minute? What about if the floods have not occurred when we expected? Is this all wasted? The fundamental aspects of no regret endorses the principle of the human life, preservation of human life, preservation of livelihood, preservation of dignity, even if there's a slight chance that the event doesn't occur, as compared to having to deal in the aftermath of an event with impacted population. We've heard also the important aspect of the cost effectiveness from the Philippines. We in WFP have also done a cost benefit analysis of force-based financing in Nepal that showed that a $1 invested saves $34 doing acting in the anticipatory window. So there is the no regret, but there's also a very important cost benefit attached to it. At the end of the day, the no regret needs to consider the fact that the investment that's made is an investment to the communities. Already investment in vulnerable areas, investment with vulnerable communities. So it's part of the Build Back Better. They will likely to be impacted at some point later on. So that investment is not in vain. Now, how do we minimize the emotional and the monetary cost of this no regret? First of all, we've heard about the importance of the disaster risk financing strategies. Anticipatory action needs to be fully discussed, fully negotiated, fully endorsed by all the parties. So when the action is implemented, it's approved, it's agreed, we've done it. We've gone through that process, that painful process of agreeing those actions. Two, we need to make sure that the actions that we're doing are still cost effective. So they maximize the impact at a lower cost and based on the available risk. So a lower risk, a longer time frame will have lower cost activities like starting to monitor into the hotspots, the at-risk areas, versus a lower time frame, higher risk, the typhoon is coming, then we invest into those life-saving measures. So we need to have a staggered approach in the way we choose the anticipatory actions. Another important point is the fact that the actions will anyway be benefiting the communities even if they are not impacted. So that mindset is there and it's very critical. There's a difference also in terms of the anticipatory action, whether we have 72-hour window of a typhoon and we need to act very, very, very fast. So we're going to likely to be doing those life-saving interventions, while we have the seasonal and subseasonal window of rainfall anomalies, and we have more time to act and to continue to monitor over time the situation and start to look at those hotspots and call in and monitor over time the potential impact on the crops, on the market prices, on the household incomes and expenditure. There's more time for us to react. So the time frame, in the context of anticipatory action, is very fundamental. And the last one I think we've heard from Alexandra is the flexibility of the investment. And that needs to be built into that disaster risk financing strategy. The fact that if the money is not spent, not invested, it can be reused to different disaster risk management solutions. So these are my few insights to this very tough question. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And you provided us a very good response to that tough question. Thank you for highlighting the importance of this no regret principle attached to the anticipatory action. Also, thank you for mentioning that there's also this difference between a short-term forecast and something that is subseasonal towards the next article that we are going to discuss. The article is entitled 3 Weeks Notice, Forecasting Extreme Weather Events with Subseasonal to Seasonal Climate Prediction. Now I would like to invite our next panelists, Dr. Turkington and Dr. Srinivasan, and of course, still with us, Ms. Ruth and Mr. Bido to join us.
Thank you, LA.
All right. My first question, subseasonal to seasonal climate prediction, it's also sounds very technical. It's not something that we hear every day. My first question to our colleagues from the ASEAN Specialist Meteorological Center and the Meteorological Service Singapore. Dr. Clinton, can you explain using simple language what is this subseasonal to seasonal climate prediction? How is this different with the forecasting systems that we are more accustomed to? For example, how is S2S different with the weather forecast that we see and hear on TV? And how accurate is this climate prediction model? Over to you, Dr. Turkington.
Thanks, LA, and good morning, everybody. And first, thanks to LA and Adeline as well for welcoming us here today. I'm really excited to discuss subseasonal prediction with everybody here and also learn from the panelists and the attendees as well. So I'll try my best to describe the seasonal forecasts using non-technical terms, but please ask if you need any clarifications. So as mentioned earlier, subseasonal forecasts sit between the weather forecasts and the seasonal outlook timescale. So it's generally taken to be about 2 weeks or 2 months into the future. But besides timescale, there's also other differences as well. So S2S predictions are actually, or subseasonal predictions are relatively new, so it's still a lot of active research in developing useful predictions. But to answer your question about the difference between weather forecasts and subseasonal predictions, I'm sure most of the audience here is familiar with weather forecasts. For weather forecasts, what we do is we take the current state of the atmosphere and we put it in our computer model and then run it forward in time and see how it evolves. However, the atmosphere is very chaotic. So very small changes or errors in our starting point or the current conditions of the atmosphere can lead to really big difference in the forecast a few days down the track. And this is really true in the tropics. It's really chaotic in the atmosphere down here. So if we're looking at subseasonal models, we can't really apply the same methodology just to run the model and see what happens. So what we do is we do lots of model runs and then look for patterns in these runs. So say, are there lots of runs showing that in 2 weeks, there's an increased chance of heavy rainfall? So when using subseasonal forecasts, we have to use them in a probabilistic sense, the chance of something occurring, like the likelihood of some climate or weather extreme, which I guess sort of fits with hazard and risk. As for the accuracy, which is the next part, I think, your question, it's not as high as the weather forecast, so we can't say for a particular day. Rather, we tend to look over weekly values. But it does actually give us more detailed information than the seasonal outlook, especially related to extremes, which is important for disaster risk reduction. And in Southeast Asia, actually, the subseasonal prediction models have some of the highest skill in the world here. So it's a good place to actually take advantage of the seasonal forecast. When we talk about accuracy, it's also good to stress the importance of good long-term weather records or observations, both to put into our models, but also to calibrate the models to produce more accurate subseasonal predictions as well. We actually use the observations for that too. So to sum up, S2S predictions give us a sense of what could be coming, a little bit longer lead time, but then at the shorter term, we can use the weather forecast to give us the more precise forecast. Hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Dr. Turkington. Also to add, as mentioned by Dr. Turkington, this subseasonal to seasonal climate prediction is still in the exploratory stage. And we are actually piloting this. We're actually looking at how we could implement this into the day-to-day operations, at least at the regional level here at the ASEAN. So we're already seeing that, as mentioned by Dr. Turkington, there's actually already some good level of skills with the models that we are using. I think a few weeks ago, the ESMC mentioned to us that there is going to be some extreme weather events. There will be wetter than normal conditions, meaning to say, based on the climate, it's going to be more rain there's going to be more rain in a specific area within the ASEAN region. And it really did happen after 2 weeks, 3 weeks. So, if we have this length of lead time, 2 weeks, 3 weeks lead time, there's a lot of early actions that we could already do. These are just some of the future things where we could really move forward with anticipatory action with the innovations in our forecasting capabilities. Now, I've mentioned about extreme weather events. Another question to you, Dr. Turkington. What is an extreme weather event? How do you define it using this subseasonal-to-seasonal climate prediction model? And what is your confidence level and likelihood of these events to happen within the region?
Thanks, LA. So in the article, we defined extreme rainfall as being above the 90th percentile, or the 10% wettest of weeks. So this value is not just one absolute amount of rainfall, but it will vary depending on the time of year and location. This is a fairly generic threshold that we used. So for a particular application or country, how you could change the definition slightly, and it should be a discussion between the forecasters or the people modeling the climate and the people using the information to come up with sort of your threshold or product that is usable for the user, but also their skill from the model. So as to the accuracy, in subsequent work with the AHA Center, as well as RIMES and other partners, we found that around 75% of the predictions for increased chance of heavy rainfall led to a disaster that was reported by the AHA Center. So I would say that's quite high, but just a couple points to note here. Firstly, the predictions were not just taking straight the probabilities from the model. We were also combining it with assessment of the model skill, as well as expert guidance on the climate situation. Secondly, I think has been mentioned before, the location is not really precise. So we would use terms like Central Vietnam or Sulawesi or something like this. So we're not yet at that stage where we're doing it for the town or city level. We're giving it more general terms. Also, while we were sort of predicting it correctly, or 75% of the forecasts were resulting in one or more hazardous events, there was also missed events, so ones that we unfortunately didn't give a warning for. These tend to be the really localized ones, so really intense short duration thunderstorms that result in flash flooding. And finally, just to add a point that was communicated to us by our AHA Center colleagues, is that when we were doing this calculation, we were basing it on the disasters reported in the AHA Center Disaster Weekly Update. And this might not be complete. So there could be disasters not included because they were too small of scale or they weren't reported. So again, it's the importance of having observations to validate and check our models, not just for the weather, but also for the impact side as well.
Thank you, Dr. Turkington. Now I would like to ask this question to Dr. Srinivasan from RIMES. With this subseasonal to seasonal climate prediction, this consists of, as mentioned by Dr. Turkington, it consists of a forecast from 2 weeks to a 2-month lead time, right? Now, this weather outlook information that can strengthen disaster preparedness, right? Is it possible to apply S2S model 3 weeks notice for slow onset disaster, like drought, for example? Over to you, Dr. Srinivasan.
Thank you. Thank you very much, LA, and thank you for the AHA Center and other collaborators. And it's a pleasure to be connecting with all of you this morning. And thank you for the interesting question. And also, Thea provided a very good background of the S2S forecast to introduce. So when we are talking about a slow onset disaster, like LA mentioned about the drought, so actually we need to think about it as a management issue which can be dealt with a spectrum of weather and climate information. So we start from we have the short range predictions, we have the seasonal predictions, and we have long-term scenarios. But S2S information that is for the weeks to a month fills in a very critical gap, which allows us to manage a slow onset disaster within that kind of a time frame. So it could be managing agricultural issues, it could be managing water resources issues, and particularly there are derived information which are available through the seasonal, sub-seasonal predictions, which will be like periods of dry spell, for example, or periods of wet spells, which can be made use of. So this sort of information is to be regarded as more like a telescopic information, which you can apply at various levels to strategically prepare your management actions to deal with a slow onset disaster or any other disaster also. So it's quite applicable for a management of a slow onset disaster. So that's one thing. And the other point is one of the issues which is coming up recently and recognized very well in the drought context is something called flash droughts. So which are becoming more frequent now and observed and recognized more in many of the Asian, South Asian, Southeast Asian contexts. So these are events where high temperatures are clubbed with dry spells, so which can result in severe stress in crops and other systems, also water resources systems, so on. So that is another issue where S2S kind of time scale helps us a lot, I think. So, but as Thea pointed out, we are in the exploratory phase, and we would like disaster management institutions to actually test it out operationally and feedback so that these systems can be made robust and we can use parameters and derived indices which are of more use in the decision-making level. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Srinivasan. For a few minutes now, we've been hearing about this weather forecast, time scales, seasonal model. What are this really about, right? So when we talk about the short-term forecast, or what we say the weather forecast, it's like, what's the weather going to be tomorrow? Is it going to rain? What's the weather going to be next week or this coming Sunday? Because I'm going to surf, for example. I'm going to go diving. I'm going out with my friends, right? Now, the other portion is the longer term, which is more about climate prediction. It's about, is the monsoon coming? Well, the southeast monsoon is going to come soon. That means there's going to be a lot of rain in the northern part of the ASEAN region. So that's Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia. So above the equator, there's going to be a lot of rain. Then below the equator, there's going to be a lot of dryness. So that's more about the long term, the seasonal prediction. What S2S is about is really bridging these two. It's like, what's going to be the long-term impact, but in something that is more actionable. Meaning to say, okay, based on historical data, there's going to be extreme rainfall in these specific parts of the region. Now, if you have this level of information, if you're able to bridge these two with S2S, another question for you, Dr. Srinivasan, what other benefits can the ASEAN member states get if we have this kind of information? Over to you, Dr. Srin.
Thank you again, LA. I think that's quite a challenging question. So thank you for that. And it's also very interesting because, when we talk about risks and disaster management, we always think about the negative part probably, or I don't know whether we can really say negative, but the consequences which are, which cause losses and damage. But weather and climate are also to be regarded increasingly as resources. So we need to identify favorable periods which can be leveraged to the maximal extent, because with increasing pressures on all the systems, production systems and every other systems, we need to use resources, particularly natural resources, very, very effectively and efficiently. And sub-seasonal information, that is, LA brought it out very clearly, which fills a gap between short and seasonal, can be effectively used as a spectrum of information to leverage the favorable part of the
I think we've lost Dr. Srini. Okay, so I think there's already this mention that aside from really from the disaster management perspective, that we could really do early actions, there are also other things or other benefits that such information can provide. As mentioned by Dr. Srini, we could use this in the other sectors, such as the agriculture sector, for example, to help our production systems. Now, talking about these different forecasting models, I would like to ask a question to our colleague from the Anticipation Hub, to Ms. Alexandra Ruth. We understand that the Anticipation Hub is global in scale, basically. And we understand that there are several knowledges that you already have within your network. Now, my question for you, Ms. Alexandra Ruth, do you use different hazard monitoring and forecasting models as basis
Sorry about that.
for anticipatory actions? And what kind of information from these different hazard forecasting models are needed to support early actions? And lastly, another question for you as well. Can you elaborate how different hazards require different forecasting models? Over to you, Ms. Alexandra.
Thanks a lot, LA, for this question, but this is a really challenging one, especially since Dr. Tia and Mr. Srini are real experts, so I'm a bit reluctant in answering this question. But let me just bring the humanitarian part, maybe try to answer more from the humanitarian angle. So for us, I mean, forecast-based financing, you know, all is really working with traditional forecasts. And we want to make this shift now to use more impact-based forecasting, because we think that it's really important to know what the weather does instead of what the weather will be. That for the humanitarian world is a real needed shift. And I know it's not easy in some contexts. So, but impact-based forecasting allows us to tell when and where the impact of a hazard will be highest. So one example is again in Vietnam. I mean, we were working with IMHAN, the Vietnam Institute of Meteorology, Hydrology and Climate Change, and they developed the trigger specifically for heat wave early actions by the Vietnam Red Cross. And this collaboration, and I would really like to focus as well on this collaboration, which is extremely important between the partnership between a hydromet agency who is providing a forecasting product that is specific enough so that humanitarian partners or implementing partners on the ground can take actions based on this information. I think that is really something we have to strengthen in the humanitarian world. And I mean, in all the anticipatory action project that is really working very, very well. And then additionally, I think it's important to understand that the hazard's impact is essential, because the same hazard can require different early actions in different places. So one example is the Philippines. The same typhoon will trigger different early actions because the impact is different on the various islands. So based on vulnerability and exposure. So the Philippine Red Cross Society will implement, for example, early harvesting to address the loss of agricultural land on one island. And while on another island, shelter strengthening kits are installed to address the house destruction. So I think it's really important to keep that aspect as well in mind. So now you mentioned the Anticipation Hub. We are, we are still in the beginning. So the Anticipation Hub was launched only in December last year. So, I mean, we need some time, but it's really on our priority list to work on trigger database that will also include triggers from the ASEAN region. I think it's important, you know, to share all this information and knowledge with the different humanitarian actors. We want to bring together the partners in the field of forecasting and allow technical exchange. And I mean, a regional technical working group on anticipatory action could also be a space, for example, for stronger coordination and technical collaboration between relevant agencies and institutes. So the Anticipation Hub is really looking forward supporting all that efforts. Now, the second part of your question, I think, I'm not sure if we have enough time, but for us, emerging topics, so for example, anticipation and health or anticipation in conflict settings is something we really would like to engage on, and therefore we need new forecasting models or systems. And so the Anticipation Hub, for example, is engaging in a new Earth observation working group, which started just recently. So if there's anybody in this call who is interested in Earth observation or using Earth observation for improving the humanitarian system, just get in contact with us. We can add you to this working group. So I think it's a broad field, you know, and there is a lot of potential to use different models, different algorithms, more data to inform our humanitarian decision making. So we can use the knowledge we gained the last years while developing and implementing forecast-based financing for other hazards, but that is where some experience is out there, but we really have to jointly start looking into it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alexandra, for those wonderful points that you've raised. And I would like to stress what Alexandra mentioned about impact-based forecasting. There is really a big difference with today there's going to be a rain versus today there's going to be a rain, about 100 millimeters of rainfall are going to be dumped on a specific portion of your country, which could trigger flooding, rain-induced landslides. You know, that level of information about what the weather can do, that has a lot of information that can be used by our disaster managers. Now, talking about forecasting, I would like now to ask our colleague from WFP, Nicholas. You are at the vulnerability assessment and monitoring team of the WFP. My question for you is, do you use hazard monitoring and forecasting models? My question for you is, in terms of vulnerability assessment, how do you monitor and update your vulnerability analysis? Are you considering the latest hazard forecasting as an indicator? And for the WFP side, how do you operationalize hazard forecasting to support your operations on a day-to-day basis on the ground? Over to you, Nicholas.
Thank you, LA. Very good question. So I think we've heard it already before, and you mentioned it again. This is the impact-based forecast, and what we are interested in the WFP is very much to understand not what the weather will be like, but what is the implication on that vulnerability. What is the implication for us as WFP is the issue of food security, but beyond that in this region is the issue of impact on the livelihoods and the ability for the population to access food, buy food, afford food, for example, and essential needs. So vulnerability assessment is essential for better targeting, because when we know the event is coming, we need to know where are the affected areas, where are the worst affected areas, and who are the most vulnerable in those worst affected areas. So already we can really get the response and the anticipatory actions right targeted in the right place at the right time. To do that, we use vulnerability indicators. And the vulnerability indicators will depend on the hazard and will depend on the different timeframes. And so what we do, we combine different vulnerability indicators into a matrix, a priority matrix. Take, for example, the typhoon is coming. What we're doing, for example, in a product that we do jointly with the Pacific Disaster Center and OCHA is combining the poverty secondary information that we have, and this is available in all the countries, together with, if it's a typhoon, the housing type or the roof type, because combining those two, poor, very poor areas with poor, very poor roof type or housing are likely to be needed to be prioritized. So that's just an example, but it's about bringing the right vulnerability indicators together to get the most possible relevant information for us to be right in terms of how do we target the interventions. The data is sitting often in secondary data databases by the government. And this is why it's important to make sure that, one, we rely on the most relevant, most recent information, updated from the census, updated from the latest surveys. What's important, and I need to stress that point, is the importance of bringing government sectors and partners together in this data sharing, the importance of data sharing protocols, because what we've seen in examples is some of the impact data may be sitting with the NDMOs. Some of the population socioeconomic data is sitting with the National Statistics Office, but the Ministry of Agriculture, the Ministry of Social Protection, they all have data. And often the data is not talking to each other. And so as we are looking at vulnerability, it's very important to create the right forum, the right platform in country to bring the key entities together that own the data under a data sharing protocol to make sure that the data is made available. Now, in instances, there may be some areas where data is scarce. And so what we do as a WFP is we work with the government to do vulnerability assessment in anticipation, make sure we build that baseline information of indicators. If we know the typhoon continue to hit the coastal areas, let's do a survey into those coastal areas, a baseline survey to understand their baseline needs. So when the typhoon hits, then we have the baseline information to understand and be ready to get that priority matrix available. Important to package the information in a readily available format for impact, an impact-based forecast. What we do is we make sure the data is packaged, is readily available and publicly available in, for example, forums like HDX, and it's for the public goods, and that's a critical part. One thing we're very, very strong in stressing the importance of a short term versus longer term. We can do a lot more on vulnerability assessment in slow onset. And we can become more sophisticated. We can bring, as Alexandra was saying, the Earth observation, but also we have the time to do monitoring. So if we know how the event is evolving, then we can start to do more real-time vulnerability assessment. We can do face-to-face. When we know there's a potential hotspots that's emerging, we can send a mission team to do household interviews, key informant interviews. But what we've learned a lot with COVID and the restrictions, we can also call in those areas. And we have mobile phones, we can call in, we know how to do it, governments know how to do it. We can call in the households, we can call in the key informants on market to understand how is the situation, how is the vulnerability evolving over time as the event unfolds. So there's very much a battery of tools that's available out there. Again, importance of having an open dialogue about what do we mean by vulnerability for a particular hazard in a particular country, where is the data sitting, where are the gaps. Let's come together with a common objective of closing the gap, make sure we have the right layers of data for vulnerability to do that fundamental impact-based forecast. So not just the forecast, but the so what that forecast is on that vulnerable populations. Back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Nicholas Bido. That's a very good point, stressing the importance really of data. If we have this forecast information of what the weather could be, and then we have a good set of baseline information that focuses on vulnerability, if we combine this together, we could really see that this weather could do something of this level towards the vulnerable members of our society. Then from that level of information, we could already identify some necessary interventions from the disaster management perspective that we could do. So these are just some of the future applications of how anticipatory action is really going to really change how humanitarian response is being conducted within the region. Now, I would like to thank our panelists for providing us with your expertise and knowledge and enriching this conversation. Now, I would like to ask our attendees, it's time for us to ask your thoughts and seek for your ideas regarding our discussion for today. So we will be asking 3 questions to our attendees, and afterwards we are going to discuss the responses with our panelists. So I would like to invite our support team to please share the link to our Menti questions. So to our attendees, please go to www.menti.com, and then we will show to you the code that you have to input in the code box in menti.com. So the go to www.menti.com and then use the code 1275399 so that you can respond to the first question that we have in here. Question number 1, how often do you utilize weather or climate forecast that you get from television, newspapers, website, mobile applications, etc. in your daily activities? Never, rarely, once a month or less, sometimes monthly to weekly basis, often within a week, or very often in daily activities. We received 12 responses. Wow, it's very good to see that actually there's a huge number of our participants, of our attendees, who use weather or weather forecasts very often in a daily activities. So you see, we've been using forecast information in our daily activities. What if we use forecast information when we shift to anticipatory action in the way we conduct humanitarian response within the region? That will be that's the first question, and then I think this will be a good time to perhaps ask panelists your insights about this result from our attendees. The floor is open for some interventions from our panelists. Over to our panelists. Perhaps I'd like to ask first from the side of the weather forecasters or scientists. Dr. Turkington, seeing this response from our attendees, what are your insights? Over to you, Dr. Turkington.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm very excited to see people use them all the time. That's very good news, but also a little bit surprising as well. I mean, in some countries, they tend to use weather forecasts more than others. It depends how much day-to-day variability there is. So I have actually talked to people that are like, oh, the weather's always the same in a certain season, so why need to look at it? But for a lot of the countries, there is significant variation day to day. So it's good to see that people are using it. And hopefully this will make it, if they're already familiar with weather forecasts, it should hopefully be easier to incorporate subseasonal then as well.
Thank you, Dr. Turkington. And I think I would like to ask another insight from our panelists, perhaps Ms. Alexander Ruth. What are your thoughts after seeing this response from our attendees?
Yeah, I would just like to see the same question to humanitarian actors. How much are we using weather forecasts and climate forecasts for our maybe not daily decision making, but in general for our decision making? And I think it would be the answer would be quite different. So I think there is still a lot to do to use more the existing data and forecasts in our work.
That's a very good point. I think, you know, what we're seeing right now is in our personal lives, we've already been using forecast information. The challenge now is to use this forecast information in our work, right? Into transitioning into the industry where we are working, specifically in disaster management. So really, there might be some, there are still some work to be done regarding this. Now, let's proceed to the next question. Next question for our attendees. What are the benefits of forecast-based response compared to a reactive one? Meaning to say, we have this forecast information, we already do something before the disaster happens versus reactive one, we wait for the disaster to happen and then we respond. I think this is going to be a word cloud, so any words or phrase, and any word or phrase, better planning, save more life. Yes. Save more life. We're seeing inputs about, you know, saving more, you know, saving more lives, less negative impact, you know, reducing the impacts of disasters. We're also seeing planning because we have this long lead time where we could already plan given the scientific information that is being provided to us. Now, seeing this, while we continue this word cloud to change, I'd like to seek some thoughts from our panelists. The floor is open for anyone from the panel to provide insights or respond to this.
LA, if I may,
Yes.
I think I see planning as a central part of that. It's true. And I think what we said, you know, if we want to do a good job at anticipatory actions is very much through planning, agreeing those actions that will ultimately maximize the impact. And where we've seen from the survey, it's all about, you know, the saving lives. So maximizing the impacts at the lower cost, but having the right information at the right time. So at the end of the day, we have this life saving and the best impact. With, you know, the cost effectiveness comes out, better allocation of resources, you know, and we need to do more evidence. We need to generate more evidence around the cost benefits of intervening before a disaster occurs. But planning is central. Reducing impact is central.
LA, if I may. So
Yes,
I think you know, it's very encouraging to see, and also very clearly, as Nicola also pointed out, planning is coming up very well, and that's good. While we are doing it, there need to be processes which can assimilate the forecast information in a systematic way leading up to decisions. And one way is we take forecast information as it is available in a very broad sense, and then try to plan things. So that is one way, but there has to be also systems and processes in place which can actually assimilate information. So it would be a good idea to progress towards more such systems to make more effective use of the weather and climate information. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas and Dr. Srini. So we really see that, you know, between forecast information, once it is provided, and then the disaster that happens, we have this what we call the window of opportunity, where we could really plan very well how we are going to respond, and we could already do some early actions within this window of opportunity. Now, I would like to move forward with the last question. Now, talking about shifting into a forecast-based regional humanitarian response. My question to the attendees, what do you think is the biggest challenge in adapting or shifting into anticipatory action? Please choose one. We are seeing a good number of our participants choosing, supporting policy and regulatory frameworks or the mechanisms, the policy and legal frameworks mechanisms that are currently in place in the ASEAN member states. There's also a huge number talking about, one another challenge is also changing the mindset. We are too used with the traditional reactive approach, so there's really this need to shift from crisis to a risk management approach. So these are so far the two largest choices. Now I'd like to start opening the floor to our panelists. The floor is open for some insights from our panelists.
Yeah, maybe.
Yes, Raymond, go ahead.
Some reflections. Yes, I think I agree, especially with the changing mindset in the beginning. It has been, from our experience, that is quite somehow a novel concept. But I think once we see the logic behind it, it becomes quite obvious. But also looking at the the low percentage of early warning and forecasting capabilities, that's somehow a good sign, that people have trust that this is not a big issue, that it will get better. We will have better lead time, better forecasting. So that's something to come. I think that is good to see. Also the limited knowledge on anticipatory action. That is, again, the more we work on it, the more knowledge we have. And again, I think the Anticipation Hub has different databases on that. So that's a good development. Yeah, policy and regulatory frameworks. I think that is that's where we have to do that, the most advocacy. But again, with the evidence and the knowledge that we will get over the coming years and that we have already, I think that is how we can support that further. Thanks.
Thank you, Raymond. Are there any takers from our panelists? I think I'd like to ask this question from one of the representatives from the member states that are present in this panel. So over to either our colleagues from the Philippine Red Cross or the Vietnam Red Cross to share their thoughts on this response. Yes, Mr. Ferdinand Ferrer of the Philippine Red Cross.
Yes, sir. I think the biggest challenge in adopting anticipatory action has been acknowledged by the attendees that we need to take action and changing the mindsets of those who are key actors, the humanitarian actors, the government, the partners, in doing things to prepare for the shift on anticipatory actions, as these needs are on the process of we have in preparation of on the climate crisis, and also the supporting policies and regulatory framework from the governments. This will help support the needs on the shift on the action to be taken.
Thank you, Mr. Ferdinand Ferrer. And Mr. Nguyen of the Vietnam Red Cross, sir.
Yeah, thank you, LA. Actually, the percentage of person who answered this question is quite similar to the situation in Vietnam. But actually, the second challenge with it changing the mindset. It not much big difficult in Vietnam, because we have been doing with the military and authority concerned, and on the people who have been working with Vietnam Red Cross Society, they are already aware of applying the anticipatory actions. What we are facing now mostly is to quickly revise and make amendment to current existing mechanisms in terms of applying the anticipatory actions. Actually, in Vietnam, we can say that the government have already implemented and at initial states. Some of the initial steps on the forecast-based financing. For example, we have the for readiness in mechanism of disaster response. It means forces in place, resources in place, tools in place, and mechanisms of management in place. So now we are working very actively with the Ministry of Rural and Agriculture and with other authorities to make necessary amendment to the existing regulation so that we can officially launch the FBF and the anticipatory action mechanisms into the mechanism of response to natural disaster in Vietnam officially. And I hope that's in the coming month or maybe coming times. This challenge in terms of policy and regulatory framework would be not a challenge for Vietnam Red Cross Society in applying the anticipatory actions. Thank you.
Thank you for the interventions coming from the Philippines and Vietnam. I think this particular response is going to be useful for the Anticipation Hub. And for us here, Ibu Adelina at the AHA Center, as we move forward in really pursuing anticipatory action into how the ASEAN region is going to change our humanitarian response landscape. So, you know, it's also, for me, it's also good to see that, you know, there's only little number or a small number of our participants, of our attendees, see that there, you know, the early warning and forecasting capabilities and limited knowledge on anticipatory action are the biggest challenges. Meaning to say, okay, understanding of what anticipatory action is already sufficient for us to move forward with this. Now, we're going to move forward with our next agenda, which is going to be a Q&A portion with our attendees. Thank you very much to our attendees who've already asked some questions. I see that there are already some questions that have been responded by our panelists. All the attendees can see these questions and responses from our panelists. Right now, there are still some questions that are remaining and to be responded by our panelists. I'm going to select one question coming from Hang Pham. The question is, the work of Vietnam Red Cross to calculate heat wave triggers for 10 cities and developing anticipatory action protocols is a great example. How did the Vietnam Red Cross undertake local data collection, assessment, and identification of locally appropriate anticipatory action at such scale? This is, I think, a question for Mr. Nguyen from the Vietnam Red Cross.
Yeah, thank you very much, Away. Do you hear me? Excuse me? You hear me? Hi.
Yes, we hear you.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Hang Pham, for the very interesting questions. You know, when we developed our EIP at 3 provinces and cities, Hanoi, Haiphong, and Da Nang before, firstly, we developed a form of assessment with detailed and very comprehensive information to be collected. And then we trained our member and our volunteer to undertake the assessment at the local and district city level. And from our experience in doing this assessment in Hanoi and Da Nang, we estimated for every district, we need about from 20 to 25 volunteers to take the assessment. And we did 3 KEP. The KAP is the knowledge, attitudes, and practice for outdoor worker, children, caretaker in Hanoi and Da Nang. And we conducted slum mapping in all wards of 3 cities to know how many people living in slum and poor dormitories to build up exposure layer for outdoor workers. And we collected number of elderly 60 plus, children minor 5, and people with disabilities to build up vulnerability index through KAP. So we understand who is the most impact and where they live in poor dormitory or slums. And we understand their coping mechanisms with heat wave to fight the gap and develop appropriate early actions. So as I said at the beginnings, in the coming months, we are going to extend this forecast-based financing in heat wave in 10 cities. And we are going to apply the same mechanisms to collect the information from those cities in the collaboration with INHAMS, the Institute for Meteorology Forecast in Vietnam. And we do the same mechanism of asking the question, taking the assessment from the people in those cities so that we can have comprehensive EPI programs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Nguyen Hai An of the Vietnam Red Cross for responding to the inquiry from Ms. Hang Pham. Now there's another question coming from Mr. Qing Yang Pang. How will the expert panelists suggest to member states 3 effective ways to mobilize current resources to implement future proofing preparedness or response methods? I'm going to open this question to the panel. Perhaps I'd like to ask this question to Raymond. Given that with the IFRC, there are already several activities or projects that the IFRC have done across the region and even outside the region. Perhaps Raymond, you might be able to share with us some best practices you've seen in those projects that the IFRC implemented in different countries.
Good. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think that's a good question. It is, of course, always a bit challenging to have the resources there also for, I guess, the capacity building for these, for anticipatory action. So normally what we try to do is really to make the most use of ongoing activities, because anticipatory action or focus-based financing is can make use of some DRR aspects, some response aspects, and then bring them together. I think what we normally do, or what humanitarian actors normally do, is sometimes quite, I don't want to say easily adapted, but it can be adapted to an anticipatory approach if you tweak some elements. And I think also the other way, some learnings, of course, from having a forecast-based financing project are then easily, I guess, adapted for response. For example, cash transfer programs that are now much shorter. We can transfer cash to people in maybe a few days, is also a benefit for response or earlier response. So I guess we have to see the synergies of what we currently do for, I guess, anticipatory action. At the same time, I think there is a lot more interest from donors to incorporate anticipatory action in ongoing projects. So we see that from some of the bigger donors to also smaller ones to have a forecast element in there. It doesn't need to be a full anticipatory action project, but that there is forecast in ongoing response. I think, actually, I wanted to come back to one of the responses I saw also in the Mentimeter before, which was actually talking about a more dignified response, which I think is an interesting aspect, because it is clear, no, if we know that something is going to happen and don't act, that seems quite strange. So looking at it from the perspective of the beneficiaries, allowing them to have the information of what is going to happen, when it's going to happen, and how they can help themselves or empower them to take actions themselves. I think that is really a more dignified way of assisting people. So that is just another aspect that I wanted to pick up on. Thanks.
Thank you, Raymond. And perhaps I would like to ask the same question to our colleague from the Anticipation Hub, Ms. Alexandra Ruth.
Yes, thanks a lot. I mean, I think Raymond mentioned already a lot of the different elements to this question. Maybe I could use to share some plans of the Anticipation Hub as well. So I really hope that we can provide soon policy advocacy messages for different regions, which then hopefully can help as well the different countries, the different actors to advocate for more anticipation funding. I think it's very important as well. I mean, I just was thinking during the panel why we were quite successful the last years. It's because of we really joined forces. We were all working together, and I think that is really a way forward as well. So it's not about the different single and humanitarian actors or the Met offices. So it's really about collaboration and constant exchange on what is happening. I think that's really important.
Thank you, Alexandra. I think we still have some time. Perhaps I'd like to put into the floor one of the questions that have been answered already. The question is coming from Ricky Di Mailig. This is addressed to our colleague in the Philippine Red Cross. Has this forecast-based financing proved cost-efficient in Camarines Norte's disaster preparedness and response? In your experience, how much was estimably saved by the government as compared to the traditional post-disaster efforts? Over to our colleague in Philippine Red Cross, Mr. Ferdinand Ferrer. Perhaps, sir, I'd like to invite you to share with us your response, and perhaps you'd like to expand it. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, sir. LA. For the question given to us, the information on the effectiveness and cost efficiency of the program on the areas being provided by the Philippine Red Cross has been limited to data available during that time. So this has been to give you information regarding that for the beneficiaries and non-beneficiaries of the shelter assistance in comparison to non-beneficiaries, that after the impact of the typhoon, we have data on how much has been utilized for the repairs of their houses. One of which is for the beneficiaries that have been given a shelter assistance has been limited to 2,000 pesos, and for the non-beneficiaries, they have shelled out at least 5,000 pesos per household. So this we can take into account the efficiency of the program for the shelter assistance that we will be having a limited allocation or funding for the post-impact activities on shelter strengthening. And for the government side, we have not seen any document for the investments that had been saved, but these programs initially are complementary to the existing DRM programs of the government. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ferdinand Ferrer. Yes, Raymond?
Just because we were talking about a bit I guess the cost benefit aspect of, because we have some time, I just wanted to also, I guess, come back a bit to the question of acting in vain. No, so we do invest quite a bit in implementing early actions. I think it should also be mentioned that our forecasts are normally good enough to say that yes, the event will happen. It doesn't necessarily mean that there will not be a flood or not a cyclone. It is just that the impact is probably not as severe. So I think it's then good to see that yes, even if the event doesn't happen, it doesn't mean that it actually doesn't happen. It just means that it's probably not as severe as we thought it would be, or it's not quite in that area. The impact is normally still felt by the beneficiaries to some degree. So I think, again, the investment that we make in early actions, there is still always a benefit there as well, just to mention that as well.
Thank you, Raymond. I think this is the time where I would like to thank all the panelists. On behalf of the AHA Center, I would like to thank our distinguished panelists from the IFRC, Mr. Raymond Zingg, from the Philippine Red Cross, Mr. Ferdinand Ferrer, from the Vietnam Red Cross, Mr. Nguyen, from the ASMC, the ASEAN Specialized Meteorological Center and the Meteorological Service Singapore, Dr. Thea Turkington, from RIMES, Dr. Srinivasan, and of course, our commentators from the Anticipation Hub, we have Ms. Alexandra Ruth, and from the WFP, Mr. Nicolas Bido. Thank you very much for sharing your insights, for sharing your expertise on how the ASEAN region could shift into forecast-based regional humanitarian response. Now, I'm going to just provide very brief takeaway points regarding our discussion. I'm just going to provide 2 takeaway points. Number 1, innovations in science, the forecasting capabilities that we have right now. This includes the impact-based forecasting. This includes the subseasonal-to-seasonal climate prediction. Innovations in science and practice are improving our forecasting capabilities and our knowledge of how to act using forecast information. We've seen from the responses of our attendees as well that actually in our personal lives, we've been using forecast information. The next step is for our disaster management professionals to also adapt the use of forecast information into our humanitarian response. Second takeaway point, disaster risk reduction is about minimizing the impact of hazards. We've seen this from the attendees' inputs that really, we could save more lives if we transition towards a regional humanitarian response. So DRR is about minimizing the impact of hazards. Early actions prior to the occurrence of a disaster can be done to save lives and reduce the damages. It's also very important for us to consider that along this anticipatory action, there should also be a no regret principle. These interventions that we are going to give to the vulnerable communities, whether a hazard or a disaster occur or does not occur, let's consider that as an investment, a disaster management investment, a DRR investment. It's also very important for us right now, since we are still in the beginning of shifting into a forecast-based regional humanitarian response to, I would say, focus on 2 points. As mentioned by our attendees, number 1 is to ready our policy framework to support the shift towards a regional humanitarian response. And second, which is very important, to change our mindset, to transition towards a crisis, towards a risk management approach rather than a crisis management approach. And to end, my takeaway point for this anticipatory action is disaster risk reduction. Once again, thank you to all the panelists and to the attendees for attending the third session of the Armor webinar series. The AHA Center is going to send out some feedback forms to our participants so we could improve further how we are handling this webinar series. And we are also going to share this feedback to our panelists, of course. Also, the discussion outcomes that we've gathered here, definitely this will be useful on how we are going to contribute towards the management, or towards the improvement of disaster management within the region. So we are going to use the discussion outcomes, the questions from the audiences and responses from the panelists into perhaps articles that we are going to produce from the AHA Center perspective. And lastly, this is not yet the end. We are on the third session of the Armor webinar series. We still have one more. So we have the Armor webinar series session 4, which is going to be the last session. This is going to be on early April. So tune in to our social media platforms for more information. Ladies and gentlemen, this ends our third session of the Armor webinar series. Thank you so much for attending, and see you again on the fourth and last session of the Armor webinar series in April 2021. Have a good day or night ahead wherever you are.
Thank you very much, LA.
Thank you so much. Well done, LA, and thank you so much, speakers and commentators. Looking forward to working with you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. This will be closed in 3, 2, 1, and